Russia tomorrow.
After weeks of aggressive mobilization raids in Moscow metro stations, office buildings, hostels and apartments, this week, Mayor Sergei Sobyanin cancelled the military call-up for city residents, 10 days before Vladimir Putin's own promised deadline.
On the completion of partial mobilization in Moscow. According to the military commissar of Moscow, the steps of partial mobilization have been completed in full. Collection points for the mobilized will close on October 17, 2022 at 2 p.m. The summons sent to people's homes and workplaces during mobilization will cease to be valid. The successful completion of the goals of the partial mobilization was made possible primarily by the responsibility, dedication and patriotism of Moscow's residents.
Many are saying that Sobyanin was afraid of the negative PR that these raids had created in the Russian capital. Video images shared widely show silent officials standing in doorways and waiting to hand out paper summons and even chasing after young men who tried to run away. Federation Council member Andrei Klishas, in a message on his Telegram channel, called for an investigation into the aggressive mobilization raids and called for investigators to legally evaluate the activities of officials who sanctioned such raids. Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu previously said mobilization was only for reservists and men with combat experience, and set a quota of 300,000 military officials, promised the mobilized men would receive at least 2 weeks of training before being sent to the front. Putin's announcement sparked protests in dozens of cities, and tens of thousands of men have fled the country to avoid the draft. The raids also served to damage the reputation of Sobyanin, who up until recently had an image of a politician known primarily for improving the city of Moscow. But in many other regions of Russia, mobilization continues at full speed.
Russia tomorrow.
The prospect of Russia without Putin is a question that has been asked hypothetically for years. In fact, the Kremlin has actively sought to link the Russian president with everything positive that happens in the country, to effectively tie his identity and presence to the fate of the nation and its people. But now the same question is being posed quite seriously, and especially in the West, and about how the war has seriously damaged the political future of the man who has led Russia for the last 22 years. With more on what might come after Putin leaves the stage, we are now joined by former Putin speechwriter and political analyst Abbas Galamov. Abbas, hello, and thank you for joining us here at Russia Tomorrow.
Hello.
My first question is about the last article of Washington Post, where it is telling its readers to prepare for the future where Putin is gone. What actually does it mean for Western circles? And I also want to ask you, up until now, if they ignored this possibility of future without Putin?
Look, the changes will be drastic. My personal opinion is that the new wave of democratization might start because the military victory of a democratic country, which was considered much weaker than the powerful autocracy which Russia was looked at before the war started, well, this thing will definitely inspire followers of democracy all over the world, including autocratic countries. And of course, all those who respected this, power and all this strong leadership, strong men like Putin, they will feel defeated. I think all the autocrats in the world will be on the defensive. So this is my personal attitude. I wrote about this the next day the war started. But, I never noticed, actually, I'm following the Western political discourse, but I never noticed them discussing this thing. I think what I saw, the Western leaders, they were discussing it, they were quite pragmatic. They were just discussing how to end the war and how to help Ukraine.
Can we see that Putin now is indispensable leader, or we can say that he can be replaceable somehow?
Well, definitely he can. Now it's actually the best interest of the Russian political system, of the Russian elites, to replace Putin. Before the war started, for many years, their interests coincided completely. It was like basically the same thing. The interests of Putin, who was the main stabilizer of the system, were the interests of the Russian elites. The rules of the game were simple. Just belong to some clan, play according to the rules which Putin sets, and everything will be okay with you. Your personal future would be bright. At least you will enjoy high social status and high income, and so at that moment, people, I mean, elites, they didn't care about any alternatives. All they wanted is to preserve the system. With a few exceptions, in general, it was like this. But after the war started, Putin ended being the main stabilizer of the system. And now, in fact, he is the main destabilizer of the system. He cannot win the war, and he cannot lose it. He doesn't want to lose it because he will become completely illegitimate, and he will have to go. So all he wants now is to prolong the war as long as it can last, because every next day the war lasts, it's the next day for him to stay in Kremlin. But this ultimately brings, he has nothing to lose, so to say. But the system has something to lose. The system is afraid of the revolution and the total collapse of the system. So now, if they change Putin now, they can still try. They'll have to work hard. Maybe they will fail, but still there is a chance to preserve the system. If they choose a successor, and if the successor is good enough, reliable enough, so the majority of the system will survive. And this is the best interest of the system today. And who is hampering this? Putin. Putin is standing on the tracks of his successor. He is hampering the system. So definitely we can expect that when Putin becomes much weaker, he is getting weaker every day, as I'm telling, he cannot win the war. His army is retreating, it's losing, and the economics is dying, and the displeasure of the population growing. So all these things, they look like a revolution coming. So the best interest of the system to stop this thing immediately, because the system is no longer the system can no longer generate generate resources to continue on this track now. So before the resources are exhausted, they should change something in the system, namely end the war, start negotiations, and start normalizing the situation, and maybe get rid of the sanctions. And so if they change all these things, some resources might appear. So they need to have a try, and Putin is preventing this thing to happen. So at some point, I think they will understand. I mean, they already understand this, but so far they are still afraid of him. They know that he is ruthless. They're accustomed to him destroying his enemies, destroying traitors. So they are afraid to come up to him now to tell, well, dear Vladimir, if you don't have other plans, please, maybe let's think about a successor. So they are waiting for the moment to come when he becomes so weak that it becomes obvious even to him. When this thing, now this act coming to him with the suggestion, let us have a successor, let you step down. Now it will look like an encroachment on an attack on his authority, and they're afraid to make this. But when he becomes very weak and the revolution is on the verge of happening, well, at some point it will stop being, like a dirty trick against him. It will no longer look like an attack on his authority. It will look more like a solution to the problem, and he will perceive it like this. So most probably they're waiting for this thing to happen, and at a certain moment, this is exactly what is going to happen. I mean, I am not expecting a coup. an unfriendly action of the Russian elites against him. What I expect to happen first would be just suggestion to step down, to negotiate some successor, and for the successor to give all the guarantees possible to him, and then step down, and then start some kind of reforms. And only if he refuses to step down, if he tells, no, I'm not going to leave, I'm going to continue the war, and then I'm going to get re-elected in 2024. After this, we might start thinking about the coup. It will be the next step.
Okay, and who do you think can be this successor? Who can replace Vladimir Putin? And also, if we can imagine, is Russian society really ready to go on without Vladimir Putin?
The Russian society is absolutely ready, and it's deep inside it wants it. Like 1/3 of the population, they want it not just deep inside, they want it like really strong. The other third of the population, they want it deep inside, they're still afraid to voice this. And the remaining third, they're afraid to go without him, but they understand that keeping him is a problem too. Basically, he has no followers who believe in him doing good for Russia and winning ultimately. Like, no, his base of support from this point of view, it disappeared. Even his followers, they are not so much happy with him. They're just afraid to object against him, and they're afraid that without him it will become even worse. They still don't believe in future with him. So the society is basically ready. And as for the successor, well, there are people around him who can cope with this job, I think. The main criteria, I think, is that it should be somebody, on the one hand, acceptable to this law enforcement and the military, on all this powerful, what we call siloviki, this, police, FSB, and things like this. And on the other hand, the person should be liberal enough as to start, untightening the screws, start beginning negotiations. I mean, the person cannot continue on the same tracks. Obviously, as I mentioned, the resources are exhausted. So, so it should be the person who will try to normalize the situation. I don't want to use the word liberalization, because liberalization, it presupposes some kind of ideology. This is an ideological thing. It should be somebody very practical, pragmatic, some technocrat like the mayor of Moscow, for example, or the current prime minister, who will be untightening the screws, trying to negotiate with Ukraine, trying to negotiate with the Western leaders, just because of pragmatic, attitude, understanding that something should change before the country collapses completely. So this is the basic demand against this, about this successor. He should be more liberal than Putin, but not very liberal as to destabilize the system. And because if he is very liberal, then all those law enforcement and the military will object, and there would be a deep split and a kind of civil war. Not like full-scale civil war like it was in Russia 100 years ago. But I mean, there might be a lot of violence, political violence.
Okay, and last thing I want to ask you, we know that Vladimir Putin declared this martial law for 4 occupied territories, which he annexed just last month. But frankly speaking, expectations were for a much bigger announcement, like, for example, I don't know, nationwide martial law, or closing of the borders, or full retreat from Kherson, or something with tactical nuclear weapons, or something like that. So what does this current decision tell us about the feeling of Putin now, the feeling of the war, and maybe about his future decisions?
My main feeling is that he lost ability to act decisively. He lost ability to change paradigms, to break trends, so to say. Previously he was famous for this. He was making strong decisions which were changing the rule of the games. Like he could start the war. Yes, it was peace, and all of a sudden the war started. Mm-hmm. So it was, Putin's trademark, Putin's vintage. But now he cannot stop war. He cannot win war. All he can do is just follow the path which is chosen actually not by him now already. I mean, now he is not so much leading as he is being led by the events. The events came out of his control. Initially, he started them. He set the trends, but they came out of his control, and now they're leading him, and he's unable to break away. So his decisions, they look weaker and weaker and weaker, which ultimately gives the elites the incentive to act. So I think if it continues like this, previously I thought that the successor project would not start before March. Before March, everybody would be waiting for what if Putin manages to put Europe on its knees with the help of this frost, severe winter, what they're promising. Europe will freeze, and without Russian gas and oil, so it will drop to its knees and crawl back to Putin, and he will start he'll make Ukraine. Ukraine will be left without European weapons, and after this, Ukraine will have to to come to negotiations table with him. But now it looks like even before this, the project might start, because his weakness, his inability to change something, will become obvious even before the end of winter. Especially, a lot depends on the situation. Everything depends on the situation on the battlefield. On the battlefield, if Ukraine continues pressing the way it's doing now, and it looks like this is exactly what they're doing, well, in this case, the project might start even before the end of this year.
Abbas, thank you for this image of the future, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you here at TV Rain.